Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year has put energy security front and center for many countries, including Canada, which may seem a little odd given the plethora of energy resources that Canada has. But nevertheless, price volatility becomes a big issue, and that's part of an energy security conversation. So I'm going to talk to Nichole Dusyk. She's a senior policy advisor for the International Institute of Sustainable Development's energy program, working on the Canadian Energy Transitions team. So welcome to the interview, Nichole.
Hello, thanks for having me on your show.
Well, I'm very interested in this because essentially the debate is, I guess, is around two areas. One is security of supply, and so we see the problems that Europe is having, particularly Germany and German industry. And the other is price volatility. And again, Europe is having an energy price crisis. And the answer to both of those appears to be domestic electricity production. Because eventually, if you can produce your own energy, you don't have to import it, then you're not vulnerable to security issues or to price fluctuations. Have I got the argument basically correct?
Yes, that's right. So what we're seeing right now are trends that have been underway for many years, but have really come to the fore in the current energy crisis. And so those trends are that inherently fossil fuels, oil and gas in particular, but also coal, they're volatile commodities. They're priced on global markets, and they are just subject to global market pressures. So they are inherently volatile. They have been for some time, and there is very little that individual governments, at least the Canadian government, can do to control that volatility. So when oil and gas prices go up, one of the only things that governments can do to relieve that pressure is to just provide consumer subsidies and just, reduce fuel taxes or otherwise give payouts. It's one of the few things that they are able to do to provide relief to consumers. Now, the other trend that has been underway for some time is that the cost of renewables is falling very rapidly. This has been happening for over a decade, continues to happen. But in the current energy crisis, or the current situation where we have oil and gas prices spiking, going to record highs, then we see that the costs of wind and solar in particular are now more affordable than electricity produced by gas. And so those systems are less expensive, and jurisdictions that have relied and have put their resources into developing wind and solar have seen their electricity prices go down. But then we also have, in terms of electrification, we have cost-effective solutions in terms of electric vehicles, in terms of electric heat pumps, where consumers can also benefit from lower electricity costs.
Now, I've had this debate with economists, and it's a hot topic on my social media feeds, and that is not the price of renewables versus gas, but the value. And the argument from economists is that a megawatt hour of dispatchable electricity, so we're talking about natural gas plants, nuclear plants, even hydro plants, is up to 3 times more valuable, and I guess has a higher price, than intermittent sources like wind and solar. How did that figure into your analysis, if it did?
Yeah, so there is an inherent difference in terms of resources like wind and solar that are not dispatchable in the same way that, say, a gas electricity generation plant is, hydroelectricity generation plant. So you really have to design your grids differently. And that is, historically, electricity grids were designed to have large single point sources of generation that flows in a single direction. You match your supply to your demand. And that's how electricity grids were created. But in the 21st century, modern electricity grids are starting to look a lot different and will need to look a lot different. And one of the key differences there is that you would have a lot more flexibility in terms of the grid. So rather than just matching supply to demand, you would also potentially be matching demand to supply. You would also be looking at things like very advanced forecasting, both in terms of supply and demand. So what capacity or what generation are you going to be getting from your wind resource? looking in advance and having very advanced techniques to understand what your supply is going to look like, but also having very advanced techniques to understand what your demand is going to look like, and then to match supply and demand with demand flexibility. So it's a really different conception of the grid. Our grids aren't currently configured to do this, but they are changing. And part of the solution to deal with the variability of wind and solar is to upgrade the grid so that we are better able to, we have a more flexible grid and we're better able to match supply and demand.
Now, this is a debate that fascinates me because I interview US economists and utilities and analysts down there. And the debate around their grid is far more advanced than it is in Canada. And they've got the national regulator, FERC, that's changing its policy and regulations. The state regulators are intimately involved in this. And the grids there are changing quite rapidly. And there are some states, I mean, not just California, but I mean, in the Midwest, in like Colorado and Nebraska, places like that, where they're integrating, they're already at maybe 35% renewables, wind and solar, then heading to 70 by the mid decade. And why in Canada are we not having that same discussion? We're just seem to be, in quicksand here. We can't even get the public conversation going around the need to modernize our grid.
Historically, electricity grids, well, I would say around the world, but also in Canada, electricity grids they're political. They're very political systems. So there's technological components to them, but they're also deeply embedded in politics. And in Canada, because electricity grids are within the jurisdiction of the provinces, they're very tied up with provincial politics. And many of the crown corporations in Canada are effectively political entities. They may be at arm's length from the provincial governments, but they're very tied into politics in a number of different ways within those jurisdictions. And so what we really need to see in Canada is we need to see political leadership. So this is not a case where, say, consumers can go out and put, solar on their roof. They can do that in most jurisdictions. They can do that, but that's not going to change the configuration of the electricity system. These are systems that are complex systems that are regulated at the provincial level. So we need to have regulatory reform in terms of how particular types of generation are valued, the market design, a number of very complex regulatory and technical matters need to be decided, and that really requires political leadership. So we actually do need to see governments taking the initiative and being proactive in order to create that 21st century electricity grid. Today, we haven't really seen that in Canada, and that is the issue.
I would agree with that. And I think one of the reasons I brought up the idea of having the conversation is that politicians don't always lead on issues like this. Very often, civil society has to have a conversation about this and debate the issues, and then we start to see the trends, people's attitudes changing, which then creates the political space for politicians to act. And for instance, we saw in BC, they came in and they vilified BC NDP came in 2017. It vilified independent power producers, which were often, run of river. They were renewables, intermittent sources, and that created a political culture that the way to solve the provincial electricity system issues was to get intermittence renewable sources out of the grid, or to have BC Hydro do it. And then the BC government hasn't given Hydro the legislative direction yet to put it into its integrated. I mean, this gives an idea of how complex it is. And this is just one province. There's 9 more provinces and 3 territories, and they all have to go through some version of this discussion and put in place the processes. And it's incredibly complex, and we're not even talking about it. And that's why I think conversations like this are really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the problem is that it is very technically complex in terms of the regulatory system. And so when it enters the public debate, it naturally ends up being simplified the questions become simplified. And so say in BC, the public versus private debate has simplified things in a way that is not always helpful. So it is a way that, you know, public power versus private power is deeply political. There is no inherent reason why independent power producers have to be the ones who are producing run-of-river hydro, right? That is a decision that's been made. It's a political decision that's been made, but it plays into this long-standing public-private debate in BC. So there is a complexity here, and you know, it does take it, as I said, it takes political leadership and it takes political will to say, you know, look at the system and set the goal to create a clean energy system that is secure and reliable and move towards that. Now, one of the ways that that can happen is the regulators at the provincial level are primarily economic regulators. So they are basically regulating cost and trying to make sure that consumers are not paying too much for their electricity. But provinces have the ability to put within the mandate of the regulators a requirement that they take into consideration environmental impact, sustainability. So that's a fix that could happen, and then regulators will be mandated to take that into account when they are regulating electricity generation. So that's one fix, one potential change that could happen that could push things in the right direction. But there are many, and you know, it's not as simple as that change only, but it is one change that could help.
One of the points you make in your brief that I think is really important is that Canadians, provinces do a lot more trade north and south with the US than they do east and west with each other. And that's a big problem because the hydro provinces like BC, Manitoba, and Quebec could provide literally, it's like a form of storage, electricity storage with their hydro dams to provinces like Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario that have good wind and solar resources. How do we overcome that logjam where provincial governments just don't want to talk to each other about east-west electricity trade?
Well, you're right. Canada is in a really enviable position in that we have legacy hydro. We have legacy hydro spread across the country, basically hydro provinces beside non-hydro provinces. So the provinces that need to phase out coal and gas are right beside hydro provinces, which have abundant hydro resources. So we have it distributed across the country. And what would be beneficial from a, you know, objectively in terms of a clean electricity system would be for those provinces that need to phase out coal and gas from their electricity system is to scale up renewables and then trade between those provinces and the provinces that have hydroelectricity. This would benefit everybody because renewables, the cost of renewables are so low right now that they're actually less expensive than the hydro. And so hydro provinces would benefit from the cheap renewables. And then provinces that have the renewables would then benefit from the storage capacity and the flexibility that is offered from the hydroelectric resources. So this makes a lot of sense. But the issue is very much a political and an institutional issue. So as I said, you know, politics are tied into this, provincial control over energy resources, and then institutional differences. So, you know, one province you might have a crown corporation that is primarily leading the development of electricity, and then the next province over you might have a market-based system. And there are real issues there in terms of integrating those two systems, but it is inherently not technical and it is not economic. It is primarily institutional and political. So this is where we really do need to see our provincial leaders primarily stepping up and saying this is a public good and we are all going to benefit from this, so let's make it work. That has not happened. I don't have the solution to that, but we can point to political leadership as really the key ingredient there.
Well, I want to end our conversation with this point, and I make it very often in these kinds of interviews, Nichole, and that is electricity is the foundation of the 21st century economy. Last century, it was coal, oil, and gas. This century, it's going to be low emission, abundant, cheap electricity coupled with low carbon fuels like hydrogen and sustainable aviation fuel. If we don't get our act together and grow our grids 2 or 3 times the size they are now by 2050, if we don't make our grids more efficient, if we don't modernize them, we're going to be, Canada's going to be penalized, and we've been complacent for a long time because we've had really, for the most part, cheap hydropower and low cost electricity. But that could all change fairly quickly, and it takes time to make, to modernize your grid and do the things that need to be done. How much time do you think we have to begin to get our act together and start to make these changes? Do we have the rest of the 2020s? Do we have, what's your take on that?
Well, obviously, these are very long-lived infrastructure, and there is a certain amount of renewal that needs to happen with the electricity grid regardless. And so we need to start immediately. We need to start immediately because we cannot be upgrading the grid and building new sources of generation that are not compatible with the pathway that we need to be on. So obviously we need to start immediately, and we need to scale up quickly. The good thing and the good news is that the current energy crisis is showing that this is actually the most affordable option. Now, this is it's shifting, right? Because for a while there, renewable energy, wind and solar, was more expensive and it required subsidization. This has changed. This is no longer the case. And actually in Europe, where gas prices are really high and that's driving up electricity prices, there's an estimation that $50 billion in fuel savings occurred because of the wind and solar in the EU between January and May of this year. So in 4 months' time, $50 billion in fuel costs were saved. So we need to switch our mindset, and governments need to switch their mindset to say that actually this is the most affordable option. This is not going to cost us money in the long run. This transition and scaling up renewables is going to create systems that are more affordable, where we have more reliable prices. We can actually control the prices. We know what they're going to be. They're going to be consistent. So it's providing that consistency in price, and that they are actually the cheapest options to put on the electricity grid, which then filters down to the cost of energy across households if we are electrifying both transport and heating. So it's good news. And it's good news that we need to scale it up quickly, because this is actually going to translate directly into affordability for Canadians.
Well, Nichole, thank you very much. I have a sneaking suspicion that over the next few years, you and I are going to be having more conversations like this. So thank you very much.
Thank you.